Thanks for tuning in and welcome back to the shop. This is our 2013 Mitsubishi Fuso FG and I'm working on turning it into an overland camper. Problem is, right now, I can't get the engine to start. If you're a regular viewer, you know how painfully long this is taking. I'm at about month 4 or 5. I think I've lost count. But here's the good news. I really think we're getting close. We have now confirmed that I do not have sufficient fuel pressure. We just have to figure out why. The reality is there's really only two things that can cause this. Number one, we're not generating fuel pressure, or number two, we're generating fuel pressure and dumping it all back to the tank. Which is it? Well, maybe we can find that out today. So what about the first option? If the pump isn't creating pressure, what can cause that? Well, number one, maybe we're not getting fuel to the pump. Fuel supply shouldn't be an issue. We do have an electric lift pump drawing from the tank and pushing to the inlet of the high pressure pump. I've changed this pump 3 times and I've installed a pressure gauge at the inlet of the fuel pump that reads 60 psi when the electric pump is running. So in theory, we have a supply pump pushing fuel to the inlet at 60 psi. Is it possible that maybe it's still not reaching the inlet of the pump? At this point, I would say anything's possible. This should be a pretty easy thing to prove because all I have to do is pull this line off the inlet of the pump and kick the electric pump on, and I should get fuel coming out of the end of this hose. There have been some thoughts that maybe if the fuel can get to the inlet but there's still air on the outlet side of the pump, it's got an airlock and the fuel can't actually reach the injectors. If we look at how the fuel flows, once it's come in and run through the pumping element, it comes up this steel line here, goes into the high pressure fuel rail, and at the front of the fuel rail we have a pressure regulating valve. If we have anything in the rail that needs to get back to the tank, it goes out of this line here and runs back through the return. We should also note that the restarting procedure from Mitsubishi for if you run out of fuel in the 4P10 does not involve cracking any injector lines. It is purely turning the key on and letting the fuel pump cycle and cranking the engine over. If you notice, the fuel rail is on a slight bit of an angle. The highest point of the rail is the front, which is where the return line comes off, meaning the air would pocket up here and return to the tank. So does that guarantee that the truck isn't airbound? No, not at all. So we can pull an injector line off, let the fuel system run, and see if we get fuel coming out at the highest point in the system. In order to do that, I'll do what I did to injector number 3 and plug the line here. I can block off the return down here. That way we know it's not bleeding through the injectors to get back to the tank. So if I block off injectors 1 to 3 like this, spin number 4's line around so it's pointing straight up, that'll be the highest point in the system. And if we get fuel coming out there, it's very unlikely that there's any air in the rail. What about option 2, where we have fuel pressure, but we're losing it all back to the tank? If we prove that we have fuel coming into the high pressure pump and we prove that we have fuel coming out of the high pressure pump, we have a suspect right here. This is my old fuel rail and that is the pressure regulating valve. This is what dumps excess fuel out through the return. If we block off all 4 injector lines, that is the only place any fuel pressure can go, as long as we're making fuel pressure. Let's start by getting a separate power source set up for the electric lift pump. Next, I'll pull the fuel supply line off the inlet to the disaster prevention kit, simply loosening the clamp and pulling off the hose. Yeah, simple, right? Oh, that's not wanting to come off at all. To be fair, on the rubber, it is pretty cold in my shop, so I think it's time we helped it along. That was a lot harder than I was expecting it to be, but with a little bit of heat, I have managed to pop the fuel hose off and we can see there has been fuel in it. So now we'll pop it off again, hopefully, yeah. With the fuel line removed, I've now stuck it into the tank and I put a little vice grip clamp on there just to help hold the hose in place. And I'm gonna take my Noco booster, we're gonna go back to the fuel pump and I'm gonna hook it up to these lines here, and that's gonna allow me to control when the pump is running and when it stops. Because if I use the ignition, the pump's gonna keep running after I shut the ignition off. After powering up the booster pack, I put it into override mode so it's not trying to sense battery voltage and we can simply power up the pump. It's a little hard to see, but the fuel level in the can is rising. This means, no surprise, we have fuel from the tank to the pump inlet. For me, that rules out the potential that the supply side is the issue. We have fuel all the way up to the inlet of the high pressure pump. So let's move on to the outlet. Do we have fuel at the rail? Now let's get all these injector lines off and blocked so we can focus on just the rail. With the lines that would feed injectors 2, 3, and 4 blocked off and number 1 wide open, the last thing I'm going to do is throw this piece of hose from injector 1 over to the catch can, just in case we get a whole bunch of fuel coming out. I don't think we will get any fuel coming out here because I don't believe it can push past the high pressure pump. We'll give it a try and prove it right or wrong. So, oh, you can't see that, can you? All right, we've got this line coming up into the jerry can here. And oh, we do have fuel there, look at that. So no air in the rail. We know we have fuel all the way to the rail, but we don't know if we have fuel pressure at the rail when the pump is actually spinning. That fuel is just from the electric lift pump. I believe we are now down to only 3 possibilities. Number 1, pump is no good. Number 2, fuel is leaking back from the rail to the tank because the regulating valve is no good. Or 3, we were bleeding off all our pressure through one of the injectors. The only way I can really test things at this point is by blocking off all 4 injectors and hooking up the Autel scanner to see if we build any pressure. I've hooked the electric lift pump back up to the ignition so I don't have to trigger it manually. We've got the Autel scanner ready to graph the fuel pressures. I did bleed anything out here so we don't have air trapped because this can't right now go to the injector return, but we should still have the rail return. Are we going to generate fuel pressure? Make sure you tune in next time. I'm kidding. Of course I'm going to do it now. Did you catch that? Let's look at the data. This is good. Unlike last time when we graphed this, and even though injector number 3 line was leaking, the pump was able to build significant pressure, passing beyond 380 bar on several occasions, and eventually even hitting 400 bar. This is in the range we need for the injectors to fire. This tool is awesome. This is a game changer. I now know that this CP4 fuel pump is capable of creating rail pressure. That means I can completely rule out a faulty pump. We can also rule out that the pressure regulating valve is dumping all the pressure back to the tank because it's still in the system that's creating pressure. I believe that gets us down to 2 options at this point. If this is fuel related, either the injectors are bypassing enough fuel pressure to send it back to the tank and the pump can't build pressure, or I've been completely wrong this entire time and all I needed to do was bleed the air out of the system. Make sure you tune in next time. I'm kidding. I'm gonna do it now. I've now reconnected the injector lines and bled them, and let's crank. Not exactly what I was hoping for, but let's look at this freeze frame. So we definitely are building fuel pressure up, and it goes as high as in the hundreds. Go back a little bit here. Whoop, not that far. So we can see that our rail pressure there was 225 bar. So we're definitely building fuel pressure. Still the question of why isn't it starting? Maybe there's just a little bit of air left in there and we're not building sufficient fuel pressure to fire the injectors, or there's something completely different that's preventing the engine from starting. I really think we're close. Thanks for watching, and this time, we'll see you next time.